Peter Reschke received bachelor's degrees in psychology and music and a Spanish minor from BYU. He's completing his PhD in psychological sciences from the University of California, Merced. Peter already has numerous lead and co-authored publications in high-quality journals, including Emotion, Infancy, and Child Development Perspectives, as well as numerous conference presentations. Peter's work on infant's emotions and social cognitions, especially related to emotions, has led one senior scholar in the field to say, "What makes me impressed by Mr. Reschke's stating his desire to engage in thorough investigation of this phenomenon is not only its timeliness, but its importance for parent-child upbringing and for behavior regulation by adults of the young infant or toddler's behavior." It is our privilege to have Peter here today, and ask you'll join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to present my research to you and where I hope to go in the next several years. Last time I did this, the fire alarm went off, so hopefully it won't be like that. Yeah, I brought the house down. So I want to start out with the question: what is emotion? Because my research focuses on emotion, and first thing I want to emphasize is that emotions are relational. Okay, so this might seem atypical from what you've heard from emotion research. But if you see this girl, you can tell that she's sad. But the important piece here is that she is sad because of her relation with her environment. Okay? And dropping an ice cream cone on the ground would be sad for any little child. I can tell you with my 3 kids that they would do something like this too. So that's how we perceive emotion, is when we truly understand it, we perceive the relation. The second point is that emotions are behavior regulators. So if we go back to our little girl, we perceive the emotion, we know she's sad about the dropped ice cream cone. But if we want to respond to her, we have to regulate our behavior in response to the context. And in this context, it wouldn't be appropriate to scoop up the ice cream off the dirty ground and give it to her. But you probably have to engage in other types of comforting behavior for it to be appropriate. And then the third point I want to talk about is that emotions communicate relational significance. And what I mean by this is we understand the relation with the child and her environment. And from that relation, we can also infer mental states. So questions like, did she mean to do that? What was her goal? Or what was the cause of her emotional state? We can also infer mental states of other social partners in the environment. So what is this person going to do? We can probably infer that she's the caregiver and is going to respond in a helpful manner. So I'm going to talk about my program of research, which has 3 parts. I've talked a little bit about how we perceive emotions and how emotions regulate our behaviors. And I'm also extremely interested in the mechanisms that facilitate how we regulate our behavior in response to emotions. So to give you an idea where I'm coming from, I have several different publications resulting from this program of research, and I'm happy to talk about any piece of this in the Q&A. I'm going to be focusing in on this study that we recently published in the Journal of Emotion that looks at infants' responses to others' emotions. So the question we wanted to ask in this study was, when do infants differentially respond to discrete emotions? And if you look at the background of this field, there's a lot of research on how infants discriminate and can recognize emotions. So from the early in the first year, infants are able to tell the difference using looking time methodology. And using less information, whether vocal or facial, as they get older. But the limitation of this type of research is it doesn't tell us if they appreciate the emotion. It just tells us that they can discriminate the actual display. So if I show you these 2 symbols in kanji, and if you don't speak any language or understand that, I don't, but if you look long enough at it, you could probably learn to discriminate the 2 symbols, but discrimination doesn't mean you understand what they mean. So if you then learn that they meant man and woman, that would be helpful, and you can actually respond appropriately in the environment. Say you're in Japan and need to use the restroom or something like that. So discrimination does not equal recognition, and recognition does not equal appreciation. So research on emotion appreciation can tell us a little bit about when infants might appreciate emotions and be able to regulate their behavior in kind. So we can look at social referencing studies, and one line of research is object interaction tasks. You place different novel objects in front of the infant. You express a positive emotion to one and a negative emotion to the other, and they'll touch the positively emoted object more than they will with the negative, right? There's also the visual cliff experiment, if you've ever seen this famous study by Joe Campos and colleagues, where an infant approaches a mock cliff with plexiglass to make it appear as if they step over, they'll fall. And it's a very uncertain kind of environment, and what they do is they look to the caregiver for emotional information to regulate their behavior. If the caregiver expresses a positive emotion, they'll cross over the cliff. If they express a negative emotion, they'll avoid crossing the cliff. So this tells us from very early age, infants can regulate their behavior in response to positive and negative emotions. There's some limitations in this research in that a lot of it only manipulates emotion valence, whether it's positive versus negative. But we know that there are lots of different emotions within those categories that are different and might elicit different kinds of responses. You don't respond to someone who's sad the same way you respond to someone who's angry at you, right? And then also the contexts have been limited in terms of what the infant can do to demonstrate their understanding. So cross, not cross the cliff, or touch or not touch the object. It's hard to differentiate between multiple discrete emotions with those types of responses. So the study, we wanted to tackle this question and create a study that looks at infants, what we termed functional affective responding, and that's the ability for the infant to engage in behaviors indicative that they appreciate the nuances between multiple discrete emotions. So we had to design an experiment that was flexible in terms of the context that we use. So these are the two contexts, a broken toy, so a little stuffed bunny with its leg torn off and the stuffing spilling out, and then a box containing a novel object that the infant doesn't know what's in there, and the experimenter responds with an emotion to that object. And so we made it so that it would make sense for several different emotions. You could be sad about your broken bunny, you could be angry because someone broke it, or it could be gross because there's the stuffing spilling out, that kind of thing, right? We also wanted something that gave infants flexibility for responding. So here's kind of a layout of the room. The infant and experimenter here, they can go engage in toys, play there, or they can go to the parent to seek security or comfort or ask information. So we really kind of opened up the types of responses that we could get. And then lastly, we were particularly interested in comparing the different responses across multiple discrete emotions. So here's a table of the 3 age groups we looked at. So 2-year-olds, 19-month-olds, and 16-month-olds, and we had about 300 infants. And this took several years to get, about 5 years, or maybe even more. And the cell sizes were slightly different just because of recruitment and other things. I'm happy to talk about that more if you'd like. So how did we code this? We wanted to focus on the function of infants' behavior. So we took a leaf from attachment research and marital conflict research from John Gottman, where instead of looking at discrete behaviors, we looked at the function of behaviors. So, for example, an infant, if they want to engage in a variety of different behaviors, we didn't code whether they went to the toys or not, but why did they go to the toys? Was it to bring something to comfort the experimenter, or was it to just go play? That would be functionally different, even though it would look exactly the same. Also, if they go to the parent, they could go to the parent to seek security, or they could go to the parent to try and be pro-social and ask, Mom, there's this situation, help me figure this out, that kind of thing. Discrete level, it's identical, but functionally it's distinct. So we identified 6 functions. So the first was security seeking, and that's the infant seeking security from their caregiver. And again, this can be accomplished in multiple different ways. They could actually go to the caregiver, try and climb on their lap, or they can look back to them, kind of way like in the attachment research. I've displayed the CAPAs here for the reliability that we conducted, and then also the emotion we hypothesized that would be the most predominant in this behavior, so fear for security seeking. Second was social avoidance, and this is qualitatively different than seeking security. It's more the infant wanted to avoid the situation or avoid becoming detected by the experimenter. And this was we hypothesized it would be in response most likely to anger than other emotions. The third was information seeking, and this is including social referencing, so looking to others to find out more about the situation. It could come in the form of asking questions. It could come in the form of looking back and forth to establish the joint attention and that kind of thing. We didn't have any specific hypotheses about that, so we kind of left that open. Prosocial responding, that was the infant's attempt to help in the situation, whether it's to fix the broken bunny by reattaching the leg, or to try and comfort them emotionally, or those types of behaviors. Fifth one, stimulus exploration. We looked at how they engaged with the actual referent or the stimulus. So were they picking it up, visually looking at it, that kind of thing. And we hypothesized it would be the least predominant in disgust, because if you think about the function of disgust is to tell others to avoid a particular referent due to its danger. And then the last one was relaxed play. So infant engaging in playful behaviors, kind of not really responding to the experimenter, or maybe engaging in more playful kind of demeanor with the experimenter. And we hypothesized that would be most predominant in the joy condition. Okay. And it's important to note that we coded these one at a time, so children could respond with multiple behaviors. It wasn't they were assigned one or the other. So it's possible that they engaged in multiple behaviors. So how did we analyze this? We put yes-no responses into a linear mixed model with a binomial distribution, because it was yes-no response, logit-link function, and restricted maximum likelihood. And because of the differences in sample size, we used Satterthwaite degrees of freedom. I can talk more about that if you'd like in the Q&A. And then we had the paradigm as a within subjects factor, because they were slightly different paradigms. And though we intended the functional coding scheme to cut across context a little bit, we still wanted to control for any kind of built-in differences because of paradigm. And then we compared responses to each of these behaviors across emotions. So what I want to show you is an example of each of the paradigms and the behaviors that they engaged in. So this first one is infant seeking security, and this is, again, the box paradigm. Oops. Oh, my audio just cut out.
There's a fobble in the box. Ugh. I can't believe that there's a fobble in the box.
So notice the infant looks at the situation and then retreats to the caregiver, okay? And stays there for the rest of the time.
There's a fobble in the box.
And the function of that retreating was to obtain comfort from the caregiver.
There's a
Tries to
fobble
climb
in
on
the
her
box.
lap. Very clear that he's kind of scared of the situation and wants to have a secure base. Okay.
Nightmares, not fumbles.
So results. So this is, I'm going to walk you through what this table's going to be. I'll use this for the rest of the results. So we've got our age groups here, and then the emotion conditions. And then here in each cell, I'm going to display the proportion of infants that displayed this behavior in each condition. And then importantly, there will be letters next to each percentage that will say which pairwise comparisons within age group were significantly different. Okay? So this, and I'm going to point your attention because there's a lot of information on here. So this first response, seeking security, we saw that infants responded significantly less in the joy condition as opposed to all the negative emotions. This didn't fit our hypothesis that they would respond predominantly in fear. This kind of went against that, but we did see positive versus negative response. That kind of supports previous literature. And then a similar pattern in the 19-month-olds. And then lastly, the youngest age group, it was kind of equally across the board. Social avoidance, I'm going to play this one again. Now this is the broken toy paradigm.
Oh, look what happened to the bunny. I can't believe that happened to the bunny. Oh, look what happened to the bunny.
So the important thing social avoidance
Look what happened to the bunny.
is that his behavior is indicative that he's trying to avoid any social interaction and kind of not be taken into account in the situation. You can see he's kind of frozen at first, and then in just a second, he does retreat back. You see he's still very wary of the situation and kind of hides in the corner, not really getting on the parent's lap. So we saw that as qualitatively different from your straight-out security-seeking response. So this is social avoidance. And again, we hypothesized that it would be predominantly in response to anger. And what we found was that 24-month-olds, that they actually did differentiate their behavior in response to anger versus all the other emotions, which supported our hypothesis. But we didn't see this in the younger age groups. Okay, so information seeking, and I'll try and just play shorter clips of these so you see the infant picks it up and is kind of visually examining things, asks a question, trying to find out what's going on. So she's saying something about the bunny's tail or something, and it's with the goal of getting more information about the situation. So we didn't have any specific hypotheses for this behavior, and so what we found was that the 19-month-olds engaged in a lot of information seeking in the disgust condition. And we think this might be just where they're starting to appreciate the differences in disgust and are trying to find out more information about what am I supposed to do, and that perhaps by 24 months of age, they've figured it out a little bit more. This was kind of a finding we weren't quite sure how to interpret. 16-month-olds also engaged in significantly less information seeking in the joy condition, suggesting to us that they were paying less attention to the context perhaps and just thinking, oh, they're happy about it, nothing to reference. Okay, the prosocial responding. So she's saying crying. So that was a verbal example of prosocial responding. So it's more of an emotional type of helpful response. So being empathic in that sense. We hypothesized that this would be predominantly in the sadness condition. And although we didn't really find as differentiated a response in this, we did see, at least descriptively, that sadness seemed to be kind of the top of the bunch there. And but though it wasn't quite as differentiated from the other negative emotions that we thought it would be. Okay, stimulus exploration. So an infant, in this, they're very much trying to explore the stimulus and figure out what's going on. This is a lot of tactile exploration going on here. So again, the behaviors with the goal to explore the stimulus. So in this condition, we hypothesized it would be manifest least in disgust. It wasn't as clear as we hypothesized, but we saw there was a lot of exploration in the joy condition and the least in disgust, though it wasn't quite significantly different from the other conditions. And then we did not see much differentiation in the younger age groups. Okay, and then the last function that I'll go over is this relaxed play. So these infants, they kind of ignored the context and just went and played or engaged with the experimenter. So you see this infant brings over a toy and is just like, let's play, kind of thing.
Look. Ooh, there's a Toma in the box.
So we hypothesized this would be most prevalent in the joy condition, and what we found was that the youngest age group engaged in a lot of relaxed play in the joy condition versus the other conditions, and that this decreased with development, which was kind of interesting. And we think maybe infants were paying more attention to the context and less to the emotional expression as they got older. And you can see that there's this trend where they decrease and that the middle age is somewhere in between. Okay, so general conclusions. Again, these were our hypotheses, and We supported a couple of them where they differentiated social avoidance and the anger condition. And again, this was really only the 24-month-olds, and that didn't really become apparent with the younger age group. And then also relaxed play. We saw that differentiation. There was some partial support in prosocial responding and stimulus exploration. It wasn't quite as differentiated as we had hypothesized. And then we didn't see our prediction supported in the security-seeking condition. And the general take-home message is that differentiation seems to increase across development. This is the first study to really have this sort of flexible paradigm and context to afford infants the opportunity to differentiate their responses. And so it's kind of hopefully a first step in what we hope to bring on more research that can dive into perhaps more nuanced responses of prosocial responding and that kind of thing. So some future directions, we want to look at constellations of behaviors, and what do I mean by that? So, for example, sadness, the predominant responses was some kind of mixture of these 4 function codes. Perhaps looking at the overall mean or pattern of infants was actually combining 2 qualitatively distinct patterns of infants that responded. So we've tried looking, we're in the process of looking at some cluster or latent class analysis to try and tease apart some heterogeneity in our particular responses. We also want to look at how behaviors unfold over time. So we just looked at yes, no, did they engage in these behaviors in the 45-second response period? However, it might be that we see increased differentiation in terms of the ordering or when they responded. So for example, if you see these 2 different patterns and there's going across time, so maybe they seek info first and seek security later, perhaps you see different patterns within emotions where they engage in qualitatively different patterns across time, or it could vary between emotions where maybe if you lump them together, they might appear to be the same, but when you look at how they unfold in the order, that you might find increased differentiation that route. And then, of course, we're interested in other types of emotions, especially with the older age group where the self-conscious emotions are becoming more developed. So shame, pride, and guilt, how are they going to respond to those situations? And then also, it's important to consider cultural responses, because what is considered an appropriate response to an emotion might vary by culture. So we're also interested in looking at that. Okay, so I've talked about the research that I've done in this area, and I want to really focus on where I hope to go in the future, and is in this third area up here. So we recently published a paper in Child Development Perspectives that kind of outlined what we're hoping to see in this type of field. So looking at the kind of separate lines of research in emotion understanding and social cognition, and trying to see how they're actually connected. So we hypothesized and theorized that emotion understanding is actually part of social cognition that involves understanding others' significant relations with their environment, and that this area that's outside of emotion understanding is simply understanding others' goal-directed behaviors that aren't significant for their goals. So it's actually very small. So what do I mean by this? So we identified 4 different areas that we hope to conduct research in each of these and look at the interconnection between social cognition and emotion understanding. So first, interpreting others' actions and emotions. Second, responding to their goals. Third, false belief understanding. And fourth, pro-social responding. So I'm going to talk about each of these. And this first one, actually, it just got published. So I'll go over it very briefly so I can get more into what I hope to do. So if I show you this picture, you could probably infer the emotional state of these people. So you could probably infer that they're angry, and we wanted to ask, do babies have these same kind of attributions that they make towards others? So what we did, and this type of this question that we're asking is, do infants make these specific associations of events with discrete emotions? So again, this was just recently published a couple weeks ago in infancy. What we did is we showed infants different emotional events that resulted in different outcomes, so a give event where they're given a toy, a break event where they break the other person's toy, and a fight event where they're fighting over a toy. And then we showed them an emotional reaction at the end of that. And it either made sense, so if you go down the column, or we mismatched it so that some of them didn't make sense. And then we examined infants' looking behaviors to these, and if they look longer, that indicates that their expectations were violated, and we can infer that they had an expectation of what was appropriate. So in this graph, we have the looking time here on the y-axis, and the different types of events here on the x-axis, and then also the discrete emotions within those. So we find that in the give event, infants look significantly longer at the incongruent sad and angry responses as opposed to the happy response. The break event, we didn't see any significant differences, though it was in the direction we hypothesized. And in the fight event, they look significantly longer at the incongruent happy response to the fight event. So this suggested to us that infants appreciate what discrete emotions go with types of context that elicit those emotions. And this was at 12 months of age. So going back to the question, where do we hope to go with this? So we find that only they were able to differentiate positive and negative events, but that we need more research to kind of to break on their understanding of what elicits sadness and irrevocable loss, that kind of thing. We hope to look at the mechanisms that facilitate their understanding of this. So context within the family. Research has shown that infants, as they begin to transition from crawling to walking, become more independent and get more into things that they shouldn't. And so they are more the recipients of their parents' frustration and anger, so perhaps they're able to use those experiences to understand how others should respond. Also, understanding others' field goals, we want to see if that develops prior to infants' ability to infer emotional responses to field goals. Okay, second area is responding to others' goals. So in this piece, if I show you this block tower that has been knocked over and there's an emotional response, you can infer the mental state that that was probably unintentional because these negative response to that. Or if it's positive, you can infer that perhaps they meant to knock over the block tower. So we wanted to ask, can infants do this? Do they have this ability to use others' emotions to disambiguate their intentions? So we used the behavioral reenactment procedure. If you've ever heard of Andy Meltzoff up at Washington, he's done this really interesting study where he shows infants these different novel objects that they build, and the experimenter engages in several attempted actions that they failed to complete. So for example, with this dumbbell, they try to separate the two blocks, but are unable to do so, so they kind of slip off the thing. And infants are able to, at 18 months of age, able to imitate the intended action. We wanted to take this a step further and see if emotion plays a role in how they disambiguate their intentions. So we have two age groups. We finished with the older age group, and we're going, data collection's ongoing with 50-month-olds. And what they did is they observed these failed attempts on all these different objects, which were followed by an emotional expression, either frustration or neutral. Neutral would be a replication of the original study, where they didn't express any emotion. And we hypothesized that infants would be able to use the emotion to disambiguate the outcome of the event and therefore be able to imitate the intended action significantly more. So what do we find? Here on the y-axis we have the number of objects that the infants imitated out of the 5, and then we have our two conditions. And what we found is that infants that saw frustration paired with the failed action imitated almost twice as much as infants who saw no emotional reaction. So that's supporting our predictions, at least with the 18-month-olds. We don't have enough data to know how the 15-month-olds are doing, but we are predicting that they will be able to do this at that age, whereas other research has shown that, at least in neutral conditions, that they aren't able to imitate the intended action. So going back to the programmatic question with this, where do we hope to take this? We find that manipulating the emotion seems to change the relational significance that infants are perceiving. They can respond in kind. So if we we're thinking of maybe having an extra condition where there's a positive reaction, and that might tell the infants that I meant to do it like this, and maybe they'll imitate the observed action more than they would the target action in the others. Okay, false belief understanding. So to explain this, here's an example. If you remember, if you watched or heard in the news this past year with the Academy Awards, there was a big mix-up. La La Land was given award for Best Picture, and they actually weren't supposed to get it. So it was this big, everyone's up there on stage celebrating, but then this guy runs in and starts grabbing everyone's trophies and letters and stuff. But one of the producers is up there still giving his speech saying, "We won, this is great," he's really happy. And this idea is belief-based emotions. So even if you have a false belief about your environment, you should still respond in congruence with your belief, even though reality should say otherwise. We wanted to see, do babies understand this? And the way that we're doing this is in progress. So the question is, do infants expect others to respond emotionally in congruence with their beliefs? And this is in progress with 18 to 22-month-olds. And what we have is we show them different events where an experimenter's here, and this person puts in an object in the box that is either one that this experimenter really likes or one that they really don't like. The experimenter leaves the room, and she switches the objects so that when she comes back in the room, she'll have a false belief about the location of the object that she either really likes or really doesn't like. And then what we have is she holds the box and then expresses an emotion that either makes sense. So in this, she believes she has the desirable object, even though it has the boring object. Or she expresses an emotion that doesn't make sense. So she shouldn't express negative emotion if she believes that it has that. And so this is, so that's a congruent condition, incongruent condition. And again, we hypothesize that infants will look longer when it's incongruent, showing that their expectations were violated, and look less in the congruent condition. This is ongoing. We don't know exactly how it's looking yet, so stay tuned for that. The last area I want to talk about is prosocial responding. I think this is getting into a little bit more overt behaviors that require the infant to engage in. So I want to talk about two different areas, emotional helping and instrumental helping. So the research on emotional helping, a lot of research on empathy and that kind of thing, we see that infants engage in empathic behaviors increasingly from 18 months across into the second year. And that infants also are able to respond to others' instrumental needs earlier in the second year. So, for example, if someone drops their spoon in this hole, the infant can help by opening the box and retrieving the spoon, that kind of thing. It's not necessarily thought to be an emotional response, but that is kind of where I'm coming in and looking at how emotions are essential for communicating need, and whether that's an emotional need or an instrumental need, it's still emotional. So we want to look at how changes in the emotional expression can change how infants perceive others' needs. So the first question will be with emotional responding. So how infants assess others' emotional, and then also instrumental needs, and what role does their emotional understanding play. And two different studies that are adapted from famous, now classic studies from Amrisha Vaish and Felix Varnikin and colleagues. So I'll walk you through these. So the first study that we want to look at with emotional responding, we have a 24-month-old and an experimenter. The experimenter creates a drawing that they love or that they don't like. So maybe they messed up and they just really don't like it. And what happens is another experimenter comes in the room, sees the drawing, and goes and destroys it, crumples it up, rips it up, whatever, and then leaves the room. And then this experimenter doesn't really respond. So this is how the original study was conducted. And then the question is, will the infant help? And we hypothesize that if the infant appreciates how this experimenter related with their drawing, so if they hated it, they shouldn't perceive the destruction as being aggressive. They should perceive it as either benign or even helpful, right? But if they perceive the drawing that they loved being destroyed as being aggressive, then they should respond prosocially. Second study, 18-month-olds and an experimenter, and the experimenter drops a pen or other simple action, tries to stack a book, or drops their spoon in a little thing, like the picture I showed, and then they're going to either reach or point for it and express an emotion. So this is the novelty here. The original study, they claim that they express neutral affect, but if you watch the videos posted on Science, they actually clearly express frustration. So we want to manipulate whether it's frustration or laughter. And then the question is the infant going to go help them accomplish their instrumental goal? Pick up the pen, helps them stack the book, that kind of thing. And if they perceive the event outcome as intentional, then it would not result to them in retrieving the pen and giving it back to them. But if they are in the frustration condition, they should be able to infer that their intention was unintentional, and they should help. Okay, so I've talked about 4 different areas and where I hope to go with this, and I want to last kind of icing on the cake. What if we put all of these together, where it requires infants to understand how emotions work with actions, goals, belief, and how to respond prosocially to others? So in this study, we want to ask, how do infants navigate complex social interactions? And we're adapting this from Buttleman et al. And in this study, infants, we're going to go a little bit older, since it requires a little bit more cognitively of the infant, and an experimenter in the room. And the experimenter has 2 different cups in front of them, and they are looking for their toy. Okay, so they pick up one of the cups, and they shake it. It makes a sound, so it's clear that there's something in the container there. And then they put it down and express either excitement or disappointment. And the idea is, if they're excited about it, they found their toy. If they're disappointed, it's not in there. But then the doorbell rings or some kind of distraction happens, and the experimenter has to leave the room. Another experimenter comes in, sees the containers, decides to switch them up, play a trick on the other person, and then places them out of reach so that they can't get them, and then leaves the room. So our experimenter comes back in the room. They have a false belief about the location of where the toy is, whether it's in left or right, and then also cannot reach these things. So the question is, when they reach to pick up the toy, which container is the infant going to give? So this response is going to require them to understand their action, and also to be able to inhibit the response to help their immediate goal and help them achieve their ultimate goal, which is to find their toy. So that involves them representing their beliefs and also their emotional relation with the toy, whether they want it or whether they didn't find it and it's in the other location. So it's kind of putting everything together in a more complex social interaction, and we want to see what infants can do. So I've talked about my program of research in this area, and as a reminder, it comes from a larger program of research where I'm actively conducting research with colleagues in all 3 of these areas, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. I'd like to thank my colleagues from all the different universities, my collaborators, and my dissertation committee, and all of you for listening. I'll take your questions. Thank you. Chris?
So, quick question. So, in the very first study where you're looking at the functional element of the child's response to the emotional situation, curious, I mean, probably not something that you study, but I'm curious if maybe you can hypothesize about, would relational status of the child to their caregiver maybe play a role in terms of the response?
Oh, I would think definitely. If they're insecurely attached with their caregiver, or even temperament could come into role here. We had 300 infants, but it was across 3 different age groups and 5 different emotions and 2 paradigms. So to look at those kind of individual differences, we didn't have enough power, but that would be, yes, definitely a future direction. If we, coming here, if I have a million infants to work with, maybe we could look at that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So the caregiver was in the room for the first study you described. Was the caregiver in the room for the other ones that you described as well?
Yeah. They're always in the room.
So did they ever look to the caregiver for cues about how to behave, and how can you code that or take that into
We haven't coded that, but anecdotally, we have seen times where they reference the caregiver, kind of what's going on. We always instruct the caregiver, if they do that, remain neutral, because we're trying to get their response, code different responses. But I've had that question, and we just haven't looked at it yet. But yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious what your hypothesis is in some of the false belief theory of mind tests, because I wouldn't expect a baby this young to understand a false belief.
Yeah, so this is going off of research from Bayer-Jean at Urbana-Champaign in the past 10 years or so. That they've kind of taken the gold standard false belief task where it's the Sally hid her chocolate in the cupboard and Annie moves it and wears, that kind of thing. And they do it with the looking time paradigm, violation of expectation, and they find that infants as young, 12 months or younger, they look longer when Sally looks in the wrong place, or looks in the wrong place for her chocolate, that kind of thing. So it seems like there's an emerging understanding of beliefs, but usually there's kind of a divide in the field. There's those that have done it for the past 30 years, and they say infants don't understand this until they're 4. And there's a big meta-analysis on that. But then there's kind of the new wave of research which is saying, well, they can't answer verbally in this type of situation, but in these nonverbal measures, we're seeing evidence that suggests that they have something going on. Yeah. Yeah.
How much variation within ages are you seeing on the developmental scale that you have? That is, a 16-month-old behaving more like a 24-month-old. What are you seeing? Are kids, is that 16 months really pretty adequate for describing the ability of the child, or is there some perhaps underlying developmental phenomena that kids are differently placed at particular ages on?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't explored looking at individual differences within age groups. There's definitely a lot of variability in that first study I presented because there was no one-to-one response to any of the emotions for any of the age groups. It was really just certain emotions elicit predominantly more, but it's all relatively more in terms of that. So that would be a question that I think we would need more data and some different approaches, I think, to look at that. But yeah, that's definitely something we'd be interested to look at. Yeah.
So one of the keys to succeeding here at BYU's ability to integrate with colleagues and be multiple levels of author on multiple papers. How could you see yourself integrating with other faculty in research projects if you were to join the school's family life?
Yeah. So as you could probably tell, I haven't done a lot of research integrating family components, the family context. So I think, working here, that would be something I would definitely need collaborators to help me understand how do we look at the family context as a mechanism that facilitates children's experiences in these domains, especially the one on children experiencing their own emotions. There's research showing that infants from abusive households recognize anger emotions earlier than typically developing infants, and that really suggests that the experience of the child plays a big role in how they recognize emotions. And so I definitely think that the family is a component that we need to look at, and I definitely need help trying to figure out how to do that. Yeah.
Are you interested in going in that direction, or is that...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. See another hand back there?
It was just the very first words out of your mouth were that emotion is relational, and going back to that variance concept, it's certainly conceivable that that you don't have to just look at abuse and non-abuse to find variation in infant ability, but you might be able to find some variation related to more subtle and even positive things in infants' experience.
Yeah, I'd be interested in bringing infants in and kind of an intervention type of thing to see if we can make them better at recognizing emotions or inferring goals, and then compare them to a group that doesn't get that, and see if experience really does drive some of this. Yeah.
What do you think some of these early emerging abilities are tied to later?
So predicting down the road,
Yeah.
that's asking an infant developmental
Yeah.
person, like how far down the road are you thinking?
Yeah, it's just, I'm thinking good old marshmallow task with President Uchtdorf's, made famous for all of us in our classes now, but the effects or lack thereof early on, or the differences really weren't connected to a lot of things early on, but down the road, is this just helping us really understand emerging cognitions of young kids, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pieces to that because you have to bring into account their temperament and their attachment, and those all have these longitudinal, multi-decade research that has those kind of outcomes and even health outcomes, and this is definitely tied into that somehow. I just don't know how. So I think that would be definitely a question over the course of a career, my career, to try and figure out how does this impact down the road, kind of thing. Where I come from, the population is very low SES, and so there's that piece to take into account too. The socioeconomic status, because that has long-term impacts as well. So it's a very complicated thing to look at, but that's why you have a career and collaborators that can help you figure that out. Yeah.
So less research focused now. What is it about this that excites you? Why is this what you're doing? What's for you in your life? What's the so what? Like why is it this?
I just really like researching babies. They're usually pleasant participants to have in the lab. But having my own kids, I always think, what's going on up there, and how do they respond to emotions? And I think this emotional development is an area of child development that it's not a huge field. So I feel like there's still a lot of questions to be answered, and so I feel like I'm excited just by all the low-hanging fruit and also avenues that have been totally unexplored. That it just seems like the frontier for me. So I'm excited about a lot of those things. Yeah.
What would you see as the pros and the cons of coming to BYU to do this kind of research?
The pros, well, having access to all the babies in Utah County, that by itself would be amazing, because I'm coming from a small college town where recruitment's my biggest roadblock, and I think I'd be able to do a lot coming here. Cons, I don't know if I've thought of any cons yet. I'd have to think about that more. Yeah.
So this is really more of a hope and a wish for you. I really hope that you have a chance to do some of that relational work, and I think you can make a real difference. Because we could have couples, the parents of the infant, do that exact task with different voice inflection and experience how what really is going on in their life is affecting them. Not whether something's in a box,
Yeah.
but what happens when mom and dad have anger in their voice towards each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope you could do that here. And if you go to other just straight psych programs, you won't be able to do that. And I
Yeah.
think you can make a real difference.
Yeah.
Because
No,
it's
that's
real life stimulus,
yeah.
right? Not imagined stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
About what's really affecting them and causing their emotional development that we see later in therapy to be so dysregulated.
Mm-hmm.
So I could just think of lots of ways to interact if you're interested.
Oh yeah.
I think it would be really meaningful research.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I think you're spot on in terms of what's really going on in the life of the infant makes a big impact. And yeah, I can think of some different things too. Maybe we should talk.
Well, there's lots of
Yeah.
options to do that in a department like this. That's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say. And I hope you consider that when you look at all your options.
Okay. Thank you.
And we agree there are no cons.
I just have another quick question. I'm looking at colleagues across the table who are starting to study the role of media early on. Have you thought about that in your work?
Yeah, we collect individual difference measures on media exposure for all of our studies. We're usually underpowered to find anything, but what we're finding across all of our different studies in the department is that infants who usually the lower SES infants, they watch a lot more TV because TV seems anecdotally kind of be the babysitter, and that they they're the ones that tend to get dropped from the study because they just fuss out, they get bored with it kind of thing. So they make our job a little bit more difficult. And we don't know exactly what to do with that in terms of what does that mean, but I think we definitely know it makes research more difficult. But we've seen evidence that that does have at least an effect on how they perform in our research. So.
Even the fact that kids exposed to a lot of media early on, television media tend to drop out. I mean, isn't that a very interesting finding in terms of how long they can perseverate at a task?
Yeah.
That in and of itself is an interesting outcome.
Yeah, we have this for almost all the research we do, so we just need to take a step back and tackle that.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, those who are having lunch, we'll do it here with Peter. A reminder of those coming to dinner, and otherwise, please join me in thank you. Everyone's fine.